Hello, my name is Alan Gregg, and welcome to our ongoing series of Earnscliffe Strategy webinars. Today, the topic is the Ontario Budget, Analysis and Perspectives. As usual, I'm joined by a number of my colleagues, but before I introduce them, just a word to the people who have tuned in that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post any questions to either an individual panelist or the entire group, and we will get to you. And if we don't, for some reason, we will provide a written response following the actual webinar. So to the panel, first, but not foremostly, is Rob Leone. Rob is a former member of provincial parliament from the Cambridge region. Much to my chagrin, he also holds a PhD in public policy from McMaster University. And when he's not wowing our clients, he actually teaches from time to time at Niagara University. Julie Gardner is an active Liberal at the province-wide level in the region of Waterloo as well. Former senior staffer to 5 cabinet ministers in 4 different portfolios. Does a lot of work on a lot of files that we're going to be talking about today. Chris Ball is a proud New Democrat, former senior staffer for the late Jack Layton and current leader of the Ontario NDP, Andrea Horvath, is also a former employee of both the CBC and Vice. And unlike our other grubby partisans, we have Marianne Carter, who is an objective chronicler of the human condition. She works out of Ottawa, major public policy analyst in the healthcare space, education, transportation, trade. She also holds a Master's of Law degree from the University of Ottawa. Marianne, I want to start with you because you watched the federal budget very, very recently. How does this one compare? There's similarities or the differences in the approach that the federal Liberals are taking and the Ontario Conservatives are?
A really good question, Alan, and welcome to all our guests. So interestingly, with the federal budget, there was a real focus and pre-positioning on this is not going to be a typical budget we've seen in our pre-COVID days. We've been 2 years into the pandemic, over 2 years in the pandemic, and we need to start focusing on recovery. And so a lot of the federal spending focused on how do we get things back on track, but also how do we support certain sectors such as healthcare that have really, really felt a significant impact because of COVID-19. That said, unexpected issues like the war in Ukraine forced the government's hand in investments in defense spending, but there was also a lot of focus on the government's environmental agenda in terms of their emissions reduction plan, attaching dollars to that more in further detail. And I think where the linkages are when we're looking at this Ontario budget and for our progressive conservative budget was quite unique. And I know that my colleagues will elaborate on this further, so I don't want to steal their thunder. But this was a budget that really focused on spending, similar to the Liberals' budget. An 198 billion spending plan, wherein, unlike most conservative style budgets, focused, what's the percentage here? Roughly 38% on healthcare spending, 15 to 16% around education. This is not traditionally the sorts of things we would see tied to a progressive conservative style budget. A lot of focus on transit, and there's some pieces around environment, particularly the critical minerals strategy that the federal government has viewed as a very strong and flourishing industry for Canada, abundant in natural resources. So we're starting to see the linkages on that in the Ontario budget as well, as it pertains to electric vehicles and, of course, the manufacturing sectors in the province. So I'll pause there and turn it over to you again, Alex, because I know my colleagues will elaborate on some of these details further on.
Thanks for setting the table. There's lots there to talk about, and we definitely will. Rob, I mean, you don't need to be a veteran political observer to know that when an incumbent government puts a budget forward when there's only 5 weeks till election day, that this isn't so much legislation as a party platform. How is this budget going to inform the way the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, frames their campaign and their campaign messaging?
Well, it establishes their campaign messaging first and foremost, I think, and not only does it do that in terms of trying to build out the province. I think building and highways and hospitals and schools and those kinds of things and infrastructure projects in general certainly were prominent, but also trying to tie together growth both from an economic perspective, but also in trying to make sure that household budgets can sustain the pressures that are currently underway with inflation and so on. So I think that's one element. The other element, if you look at the budget, it's very targeted in terms of where the money's going, and money being driven towards key electoral battlegrounds. Some of the infrastructure projects are even divided out by region, so that sort of as to demonstrate that this province has been thinking about not just the Greater Toronto area, but Southern Ontario, Northern Ontario in particular, getting a lot of play in this budget. And so you get to see a bit of who the Tories will be targeting in this election.
Chris, the NDP are making a major claim that they are the official opposition. Anyone who wants to stop Doug Ford, that is the most obvious route to that. And how are they going to respond to this budget? Do they see any vulnerabilities that they're going to exploit?
For sure. I mean, since, like, as Rob said, this is kind of like the de facto kickoff of the campaign. And, campaigns aren't really about finding like the right answer to a million specific issues. It's really a battle for the question itself, to which you should be the only answer. The budget will probably be treated by Team NDP a bit like a Conservative campaign stop. Won't necessarily fall into the trap of making the next few weeks only about the budget, like really diving deep into every specific little detail as you might in the legislature in a normal circumstance. What you'll see them do, though, is harvest things that kind of reinforce their already established early campaign messages, which are Liberals and Conservatives broke the things that matter to you, and we're the ones who are going to fix it. Doug Ford's cuts will hurt you and your family. And with 40 seats in the legislature, the Ontario NDP, as you said, is the only electoral vehicle able to beat Doug Ford. So they're going to focus on things like that the budget is $2.7 billion short on spending to keep up with inflation, which can translate into cuts on health and education. They're actually in Scarborough today, which is a hopefully vote-rich area, or at least they're hoping it's a vote-rich area, to reinforce that message now. They seized a little bit on a gaffe by the minister, who said that there was no guarantee that the government would retable the budget, leading to some speculation that there's like a secret budget hiding somewhere that may have more cuts than people think. But no party really had a particularly devastating retort to the budget, I'd say, because the budget is again, it's a bit of a trap. And most of the first week of the campaign is kind of already locked for people. Like, the ad space is bought, the tour plan, they know where they're going, the message box is crafted. So parties want to avoid anything that kind of throws them off of their game, because again, it's that battle for the question. What is the one question I need to be the answer to? And getting distracted by anything else is bad news when it comes to a campaign.
Julie, Chris just said the budget can be a trap. And Marianne pointed out, this is not a typical Conservative budget. Very, very proactive. A lot of initiatives, kind of a chicken in every pot. In an attempt probably to try to outmaneuver the Liberals to the center, trying to move a little bit, much like Aaron O'Toole did in the last federal election. What kind of defense can the Liberals put up to make sure that that doesn't happen, that they aren't successful in occupying the big center?
Yeah, Alan, I think that the Liberals had anticipated this. I mean, clearly there were a number of announcements before $11 billion of spending had rolled out before the budget was even tabled. So there were really not a lot of surprises for the Liberal camp in this budget and the direction that it was heading. I think that they will use it and to leverage it to their strength. Stephen Del Duca has been saying that we need real leadership back in Ontario. And I think that the fact that this budget has been tabled will not pass, and then they are not committing to reintroducing it is going to kind of further that narrative that this isn't real leadership, this isn't even a real budget or a real plan, and that the Conservatives really don't know what they want to do for Ontario, and that this is just more politicking by Doug Ford. On the infrastructure side of things, certainly there is a ton of investment there. But again, I think the Liberals will go back to some of the core messaging that this plan lacks ambition, and that the investments that they're making, although they're not going to criticize them, who could, for new investments in hospitals and major transit infrastructure. But what they will say is that this is all critical spending that absolutely needs to happen and is just table stakes and doesn't present a true vision for the province of Ontario. On the health and or the human resources side of things, I think the skilled trades investments are going to be well regarded by all. They are, I have to give compliment here. They are doing a very good job of this. They've reduced a lot of red tape, and they're getting money into the hands of those that can deliver critical training and skills to the people of Ontario who are going to be desperately needed to help rebuild the economy. That said, on sort of the other side of the human resources front, on the healthcare, again, there'll be criticism for lack of ambition and a lack of inspiration to really get at the root of the problems that are facing the healthcare sector and really challenging healthcare retraction and retention.
Rob, earlier this month, the Ontario Financial Accountability Office issued a report that says, it's possible to bring this budget back into balance by next year. Now we find the budget is going to be in balance in 2027, 2028. In fact, this is the largest spending budget in Ontario government history. What happened?
Like an election. I mean, the financial accountability officer doesn't have to abide by the political cycle as much as the governing party. And I think there's lots of pre-election goodies that were announced, as Julie mentioned. $11 billion pre-announced before the budget actually was tabled, and even more goodies were in it for a lot of different initiatives. Cogently put together inside a budget. So I think that's one answer to the question. But I also think that the budget does have, if you look at the document, a projection, but also if economic growth is faster or slower than those projections, and of course there's a lot of private sector input in terms of what those projections are. And in the faster growth band, the budget could balance in 2024, 2025. So I think it pays a little bit of homage to what the Financial Accountability Officer was doing, but also trying to be as prudent as possible to recognize that there is uncertainty, inflationary pressures abound, there is global geopolitical instability that are obviously going to affect potential economies going forward, and supply chain issues and other things that are currently present in our economy, as well as labor shortages. I think there's also a lot to be said about that. So the difference between the bands of the faster growth band and the slower growth band, that projection band, as it widens out to 2024, 2025, is $17 billion. So they've given themselves quite the range in terms of where this might look out, and that's typical when you're trying to do medium to long-term projections like this.
I want to get Julie and Chris back in here because I'm old enough to remember when Paul Martin built his political career as a deficit fighter from hell or high water. I mean, this budget, the debt to GDP ratio is flat for the next 3 years. And the Liberals at least had it going down. Is deficit fighting, is bringing the budget back into balance a non-issue for the foreseeable future? I mean, I doubt you're going to see any griping from either the NDP or the Liberals on the spending front. Are you, Chris?
I mean, spending on things that matter to people is a good thing. And I think where we get into a bit of trouble is what happens on the back end with, like, and one of the messages that the NDP is sending is what happens on the back end, though, when the Conservative government looks around and says, oh, wait, actually, we need to cut that, and that. And let's be really, really laser focused on the deficit and trying to tie that to people's pocketbooks and all these other things. So, I mean, from a New Democrat perspective, what the party has been doing and sort of the track that they've been laying on that piece is they're not looking to raise your taxes. They're looking to keep middle class taxes at like a normal rate, freezing them for the next 3 or 4 years. So there's some concern around, you know, spending going like insanely crazy, but definitely where that money gets spent and who and how it has the best impact on just everyday working people is probably more of the focus for Team Orange, I'd say.
That this could be a Trojan horse that come back and bite you in the future.
I mean, 2015 Tom Mulcair wasn't, you know, there was a bit of an issue there, so we'll see what happens.
Julie, how did we shift from government spending to government investment?
I love the new word. Investment is just so much more savvy, and it probably came from a poll, Alan, maybe one that you or campaign research had run. But investment certainly is supported by the Ontario people, and I think that Ontarians are going to be looking at this budget and, like Chris said and Rob before, investment in areas where people are prioritizing is going to be regarded as positive. There will be some concern that, again, that things are going to come and bite you in the butt. But where I think that people are going to take a bit of a more critical tone is on things that they see as unnecessary spending. And I'd like to point to kind of the driver's license stickers. Although I know some people do find it a positive initiative, that's taking $1.1 billion out of the provincial purse. And when you look at the investment that's happened in long-term care, and you compare it as being almost $800 million, 1.1 billion, if we put it right back into long-term care, may have been a better choice to make. And so I think we're going to be critical of some of those gimmicky type of things that put money in people's pocket and take money away from our provincial coffers that could be either used to reduce deficits or to invest in areas where people are prioritizing and where there is real need. And affordable housing would be right up there as well.
So it's not so much spending, but the priority that's indicated through spending. Marianne, I mean, the pandemic has cast a very long shadow over Canadian politics over the last 2 years. And in the early stages, I mean, it really seemed to favor the incumbent, that people were looking very positively on their governments as they responded to pandemic management. We saw a whole bunch of governments being reelected. Our own research shows that in the last 6 months, sentiment has turned much more negative. What is this budget trying to do in terms of COVID-19? Is it trying to put it in the rear view mirror, or is this government now trying to bolster its management record of what they've done in the past?
That's a big question. And in my perspective, in some respects, they're trying to put it in the rear view mirror. Look, there's been pandemic fatigue. I think we can all agree the pandemic is not over. We're still actively navigating both at the federal and provincial levels, various different policy changes, and people are still being admitted to the hospitals, and we're in the sixth wave. So the interesting part about what Doug Ford is doing, though, is, like, as we've mentioned, this is a very different type of budget. It's very much equated to an election platform. They are having their election on June 2nd. There are clear linkages to what they're trying to communicate to the public in terms of let's forget about the ongoing mountain and valleys between the lockdowns and the mask mandates and some of the things that have really frustrated folks over the last 6 months. And let's look forward to the future and where we can support people. I think even it is framing it as investment, as Julie pointed out, Ontarians like investment. Investment, positioning it as an investment versus spending elicits a very different perspective, I think, for a voter. And so when there's things like affordability issues, healthcare, we've seen gaps in our healthcare systems that were long existed, but were exacerbated by the pandemic. Transit. These are sectors that most Ontarians recognize need strong investment, whether or not they're on one political side or the other. It's how that investment is done. And this particular government has positioned it in these, in your back pocket tax breaks, the license plate stickers, that sort of thing. But, especially in the 905 region, where affordability is very much on the top of mind for all people, but it varies in varying demographics, particularly in younger people who are struggling to even buy a house, right? And so in terms of the positioning of connecting it to their election of "let's get it done," their slogan, it's very much trying to provide the steps necessary to launch into their campaign over the next month or so.
Chris, there's lots of stuff in this budget about highways and driving. In fact, in one of the pillars, keeping costs down, of the 4 major items they cite there, 3 of them relate directly to benefits to car owners. Yet, any environmentalists will tell you this is bad public policy, building more highways, reducing tolls, the point that Julie made, eliminating the license fee. Is the NDP prepared to take them on this, or is that constituency, that the kind of a suburban commuter, just too important electorally in Ontario to tackle this?
I mean, the Ontario NDP released its climate plan about 6 months ago. So they're definitely in that fight. And it's important for all parties to have a real, credible, costed, ambitious plan to tackle what is the largest existential crisis we have as a species. So for me, it's the pressures should actually more be on the parties without those types of investments, and then without those types of plans. The NDP certainly understands that people need to get to work, right? So PSW in Oshawa probably needs a car to get over to your mom's house to do their job. And so the challenge for all parties is not to fall into this false dichotomy of car driver versus Mother Earth, right? You can do that by laying out an auto strategy that focuses on EVs and on no emission vehicles, which the NDP has done. You can provide other options for folks and make them attractive. Let's look at more fast, frequent options so that people aren't just sitting on the 401 in gridlock spewing greenhouse gases, right? And let's make it convenient for folks. So the challenge is kind of not accepting the premise that you have to be anti-car to combat climate change. And it's connecting kind of government action on climate to people's lived realities, and again, giving them those better options that are viable, and then helping them along that path, which for a lot of folks can be kind of scary or seen as expensive, or even punching down on their way of life, right? Car is not just a car, it is a bit of a cultural piece too, and it's about freedom. There's a whole bunch of other things that are tied up into having a car, right? So that's the real trick of leadership, and I think we're showing that, or the ONDP has been showing that, of taking people on that journey, not just sort of satisfying the status quo to get a vote, because if we keep doing that, things are going to get a whole lot hotter around here, climate wise. So yeah, it's not about anti-car, it's about providing a whole bunch of different solutions and making people, making them attractive to people and connecting them to their daily lives.
Julie, on the other side of the ledger, to give the government a little bit of credit, within a massive infrastructure commitment, the single biggest item is transit. You've been working on this file for years in terms of the Kitchener-Waterloo, Toronto corridor. What do you make of the transit commitments in this budget?
So look, congestion and gridlock is a huge issue when it comes to the cost of our goods and services, as well as talent attraction and people's just quality of life. Is also a huge environmental issue. For the PCs, their transit agenda has really focused on people and the time it takes you to get to work. and improving your quality of life. So kind of going back to some messages that had played really strongly for Doug Ford in the 2018 election around kind of really being people-centric and everyday people. The one thing that strikes me in terms of their transit investments is that they're not only focused on the Greater Toronto area, they're really spreading a lot of their investment outside into communities like Kitchener-Waterloo and beyond to London. You saw that in the kind of the GO expansion plans, as well as out to Bowmanville. So whereas transit was almost synonymous for a little for quite some time in the early days of Metrolinx with just the 416 and maybe out to the 905, it's now really including your 705s and your 519s in the area codes that are also impacted by transit. I would say my one concern with this is, in kind of going back to Chris's point about making choices, is that transit and investments in transit only make sense if we can drive ridership. And ridership really comes from that frequency of the service that's available and how quick that service can be. So a 4-hour trip from Toronto to London is not something that's going to be palatable when you can get there in 2 hours in a car. So we really have to think about these investments, and the PC government really has to think about supporting these investments with the things that are going to drive that ridership and really drive the changes that are going to be impactful, or else they're going to end up creating a whole bunch of lines and services that are not utilized by Ontarians and really just drive more people to the 400 series highways.
Marianne, you've been monitoring the questions there. Is there anything you want to bring up to the panel or panelists?
Yes, there's a couple questions, and let's pivot back to education a bit more deeply. How vulnerable are the Conservatives with respect to school funding and the relative lack of investment in our classrooms?
Rob, you want to go there? You're an educator yourself, Conservative. So,
you know, I always love I love this issue. By the way, it's obviously a passion of mine, and but the kind of rhetorical kinds of conversations people are having on this issue, I think, are also interesting, but interesting in a way that you really, I think what's clouding really what the public actually understands the problem to be, right? They say, well, those money has been cut, and you know, which the opposition will say, and then the government will say, actually, we've invested billions upon billions of dollars more in education consistently year after year over the last 4. And I think the projections show that, and the budget shows that. And so the public, I think, gets really confused by the messages of both the, you know, the government on the one hand, who's saying we are investing more, here's our proof, and the opposition and certainly the stakeholders who are saying, no, you're actually not. And I think it just leaves people in a state of confusion. So, you know, if you're looking at the electoral impact, I think certainly it motivates stakeholders to a degree where, you know, you can point to a fact or a figure and make some grandiose claims about it. But overall, I think what we've seen is that the government has been slowly and cautiously increasing those budgets in education. Now, what does that mean at the end of the day? It's not just about spending more money, but spending it better. You know, there were a number of initiatives throughout the last few years that were suggested and proposed and failed, some due to court challenges that I think that remain legacy items for this government. But ultimately, I think that the education system and the focus on you know, trying to promote the skills trades, trying to promote STEM, improving mathematics in our schools, land very well with voters. And you know, so we can talk about the rhetoric and the spending and trying to make this claim that the Conservatives are cutting or not cutting. But ultimately, what I think as parents, and I have 3 kids in school, you know, I'm looking for what happens with my children and what the system is able to do for them. And ultimately, that's what I'm going to be basing my judgment on.
Rob, off the top, you said there's a lot of targeted spending here that is, you know, geared to very specific political needs and ends. They're spending money in education, but it's not across the board. Very little talk, other than the tuition freeze, about spending at the university levels. A lot of training work, a lot of apprenticeship work, a lot of lifetime learning stuff. What are they trying to do here, Julie?
Really, I think I'm really confused at this investment. Certainly, I mean, we've always known that the Conservatives have not been as supportive of the post-secondary, in particular at the university level, as they have been at the colleges and investing in the skilled trades. I think Minister McNaughton, in almost every speech I've seen him give in the last little while, has talked about the investments they're making in terms of in jobs for people who shower at the end of the day versus the beginning of the day. I'm not sure, though, what they're trying to do. Like Catherine Fife said yesterday in the legislature, she said, what progressive country is not investing in post-secondary education? And I thought this was a really interesting and good line, because it is really concerning. If you look at what jobs are needed to fuel our economy and what jobs are going to be needed in clean tech and some of the strategically competitive areas where Canada and Ontario thrive, it is jobs like engineers and computer scientists and others that require a post-secondary education at the university level. And over the last 4 years, we've seen only freezes and cuts to tuition, which do pinch at the finances of universities. And then we've seen no investment in university infrastructure, which continues to crumble, as all kind of areas of infrastructure in our province are right now. So in terms of it not being kind of a popular message with their voters to be investing in the university, if that's where they're trying to kind of focus investments where it is going to track better with their voters, that may be the strategy here. But I think it kind of is a really risky strategy for Ontario and Ontario's economy.
I want to bring Chris in.
Can I get in on that, Alan, for a
Yeah,
second?
go ahead, Rob. Sure.
Just because I think I mean, if you're trying to understand what they're trying to do in higher education, I think, Julie's criticism is correct. I think that there is for all those reasons, but the missing element, and the one I wanted to add here, is that there does desperately need to be a link between what's happening in our higher ed system and what's going on in the economy. There are certainly jobs available in the economy. We hear it every day with our clients. We hear it every day when we're just walking down the street and looking at the for hire ads that are going out there. And so part of this, the part that we're not talking about is the realignment in our higher ed system to meet labor market needs and demands. And I think part of the challenge that universities have is that they're not nimble enough for a lot of reasons, and I'm not going to get into the thesis on that, but they're not nimble enough, at least in the eyes of this government, they're not nimble enough to meet those labor market needs. And so it does require a revised thinking, right? And I think the other element here is that the government is not looking at 4-year degrees as being the panacea of education anymore. They're looking at trying to break that down. And one of the major initiatives that has occurred over the last 4 years is this focus on micro-credentials, right? So it's not the sort of big university degree. It's about training people very specifically, or upskilling people into jobs that are available. And I think that's just it's a paradigm shift, if you will, in terms of our thinking about higher education.
I want to bring Chris into here because I think there's a political angle as well. I mean, one of the 5 pillars is called working for workers. And it's become, I think, a fairly accepted political convention now that for conservatives to win anywhere in North America, they have to attract blue collar workers. And the Doug Ford government, I think, uniquely understands that. And the polling suggests that, the difference between federal PC voting, conservative voting, and provincial conservative voting rests with new Canadians and blue collar workers prepared to support the provincial PCs and not the federal. This is a big threat to the NDP. How do you normally the Conservatives would go after the Liberals and try to get Liberal votes. This is something that would potentially erode NDP vote. What's the defense?
Yeah, I mean, so I see this as there's been some undercurrents to this thing happening, and sort of that push and pull for the working class vote inside the NDP, and also just in our broader politics. So for me, I would say that the Ontario NDP can sometimes do with a little bit more of a healthier dose of like I see you in their politics, which is kind of a bit of a broader question than just sort of an election tactic. but something that's really important for the party to kind of get its head around, to have an answer for. Because there used to be a Venn diagram in Ontario politics that was kind of a bit of a sweet spot for the NDP for years, which was union worker, sun reader, before they went a little bit nutty, and then NDP voter right in the middle, right? And so slowly but surely that Venn diagram has kind of faded away. And so while we're present at the picket lines, bringing questions forward brought to us by union leadership and activists, and we're doing that frontline work, and we have the support of the majority of the unions in the province, but unions also aren't monocultures, right? And the shop floor sometimes may not feel seen by us or even their own leadership sometimes. So I think there's a little deeper, we have to go a bit of a level deeper in the understanding of the nuances that make life harder or more expensive for people. So if not, I feel like we might continue to suffer from a bit of a salience problem, right? So, and what I mean by that is a majority of folks in the province, we can all agree, healthcare needs to be fixed, education needs to be fixed, long-term care needs to be fixed. Those are common goods that we need to put the full resources of the government towards. But come election time, those aren't necessarily the things that we're voting for or the parties win elections on, because the things that are really stressing people out, the cost of gas, grocery bills, all those things have a higher salience in people's lives, and they're more front and center. And I think sometimes they need to be a bit more front and center in our campaigns. And now the good news, after that dour setup, is that we have that club in our bag, right? I go back to my old boss, Jack Layton's ATM fees campaign, right? It was, again, right in that sweet spot of us standing up for the little guy against a big corporation, the big banks, about something that seems really small, but ticks a whole bunch of people off and makes a small but important financial impact. So a little bit more of that sort of I see you in New Democrat politics, I think could be very useful. Now, that's not to say they're not doing some of this. Like, if you look at the latest ad that they put out, putting Andrew Horwath as leader in the window, they're telling that story that she's of you, right? Like she was a union organizer for years. Her parents were janitors. Like it. So just showing a bit more of that piece and that connection to like people's daily lives rather than this like huge theoretical debate might be helpful.
Right. We represent, labor as well as, all sorts of clients in different areas. And I remember having a conversation with one of our clients about this very fact, which is this realization that as union members, they do vote for their union leadership to conduct the businesses of the union. And it was this realization that many of those union members voted for Doug Ford. So they're both looking at the same problem from different lenses, but the same problem, right? And I think for the NDP, it's about how do they tap into that energy, right? How do they tap into that energy and say, okay, look, you've got problems. I know you're listening to the government's perspective on this, but here's a different way, here's a different path. And I think if they could weave that, there might be an interesting fight. But I have to say though that out of any Tory government that we've seen in a long, long time, this one is the most pro-union that we've ever seen, I think. And there's a very clear, dedicated approach to labor and focusing on those concerns. And I think that's just a novel approach. And I think that when you see Doug Ford, he's making a speech, and you're like, wow, that's pretty like not as the prose is not quite as eloquent as it needs to be. But I think it really hits at people who are frontline workers and who are blue collar workers. So I know Chris,
you want to respond to that, and then I want to go to Marianne.
Yeah, because I think politicians for a very long time, this is like the comms guy in me coming out. So politicians for a long time, there's been this pattern where it's like, I went to Oshawa and I met a steel worker, and steel worker told me like they just landed in a UFO and finally learned what a steel worker is, and then I am telling you what their life is about. Whereas there's a particular cadence to how conservatives communicate this stuff, in that they just like kind of tacitly accept the reality of their voter base. And they're like, yeah, this sucks. This is something that's really annoying. And this is something that's really bothersome. And I see it too, versus that sort of disconnected rhetoric of the other day I was in this city. So I think there's also there's a style and a comms challenge to this as well that we have to do a slightly better job of getting our head around.
Marianne, one of the best political strategies ever is to find someone, run against someone who's less popular than you and isn't on the ballot. And this has been a federal provincial tactic for forever. And we saw this in 2018 and 2019, provincially and federally, respectively, is Doug Ford was after Justin Trudeau all the time, and Justin Trudeau was after Doug Ford all the time. No more. There seems to be an entente between the two, and reflected in the negotiation where they finally found some agreement over childcare. What's going on here?
So it's really quite fascinating, and I believe I'm not the only one to feel this way, because I've read a bit about it in the media over the last few weeks, but particularly following the release of Ontario's budget yesterday, that despite Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau's very different political brands, they have laid out remarkably similar plans. Let me elaborate on that. So you have the federal budget 3 weeks ago, and then you have Ontario's yesterday. And this ongoing framing of the economic challenges that are facing Canadians and Ontarians alike is similar. You know, we've touched on a lot of these things as it pertains to affordability, focus on getting the economy back on track. Canadians are concerned about healthcare, education, all sorts of things. But I go back to the investment piece. Both the language of Trudeau and Ford's budgets focused on investment and getting back on track. This is quite interesting, and I don't know if we've really seen something like this. Obviously, the pandemic has provided a backdrop, and maybe the timing of the Ontario election so close to their budget and how everything fell with the federal budget. But one of the things I was mentioning yesterday to a few of our colleagues is that, you know, a lot of times there's this piggybacking off of what the federal Conservatives would be doing and how that would match up. But as many of our viewers will know, that they're in the middle of a leadership race. There's a lot of soul searching happening in the federal party right now. And you know, with the province just being the last province to strike a deal with the feds and getting the childcare deal done, that's quite significant and quite a nice little ornament to hang on the Christmas tree prior to running in an election. Regardless of what party you align with, most Canadians are not complaining about having a more affordable childcare, particularly in parts of Ontario where it's very expensive to live. The question is about the spaces, are there enough workers, all these sorts of things. So, I mean, this is my very roundabout way of answering a question that in many ways, Alan, that Trudeau's and Minister Freeland's budget offered like a backdrop and platform to sort of support what the PCs wanted to do and almost distance themselves from some of the negative dynamics that are happening within the federal Conservative Party right now.
Julie, there was one item in the budget that arguably was kind of an outlier, but might be emblematic of a larger trend. And this was the announcement that they were going to move the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board out of Toronto to London, Ontario, and signal further to the extent that there are future agencies, they also would be located outside of Toronto. Is this an anti-Toronto kind of sentiment on the part of Doug Ford, or is it political targeting, or is there something larger at work here?
So the cynical side of me would like to kind of chalk it all up to political targeting and politics, but I really do think that there's something larger going on here. I do definitely think, you know, investments tend to follow those where there's a squeaky wheel. And let's face it, the majority of Doug Ford's caucus is outside the boundaries of Toronto. And so he's hearing from his colleagues about the investments that are needed in their communities. So I think that does necessarily drive investment to those communities for good reason, and then sometimes for political reason. But I also think that there's been a trend, and it's a really unfortunate trend that's been happening over the last number of years, where the bulk of the prosperity and the economic growth has been happening in concentrated urban centers. And so I do think that these moves are kind of multifaceted. Number one, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have the WSIB headquarters located in some of the most expensive real estate in the country. We've got it on Front Street, right across from the Metro Toronto Convention Center. And so it doesn't need to be there. It could be anywhere in the province. So we're going to save some money, which was a theme, and certainly Minister Bethlen Fawley championed early on in this government's mandate. But it's also to kind of drive some of that economic growth and prosperity, I think, to communities that have been unfortunately kind of hit by some of the economic trends that have been happening in the last number of years, and drive some really great jobs to them. So definitely kind of politicking, so kind of multifaceted in the sense that, you know, we've got champions that are calling for these investments to be made in their communities, and that's resonating with Doug Ford. You've got some polling that's saying we've got to spread some investment out and see not just the 416 benefiting from economic prosperity, and then you've got cost cutting, I think, that's driving some of this thinking. And I think by and large it's going to kind of spread out that prosperity through our province in a better way, and kind of anchored on kind of investments in battery factories in Windsor and the Ring of Fire in the north. And then you've got Oshawa certainly booming now with the announcements of GM. You've got Ingersoll back online with Cami. You've got a lot more kind of diversity in terms of where that economic wealth is being generated in the province. And I think that's a good thing.
Given the importance of Toronto proper to the Liberal base, I mean, it's the only region where they are leading right now in the polling. I mean, is it in Del Duca's interest to take them on this decentralization of resources outside of Toronto?
I don't think that Del Duca is going to take him on the decentralization of those resources where they make sense. If there are certainly things that look like underhanded political decision making that shouldn't have been allocated there, certainly those things will be exposed through the election campaign and beyond. And certainly, you know, there are a few decisions that have been made over the last number of years that do and you know do kind of speak to kind of party insiders maybe dictating the way that the money flowed or the direction of things. So that's kind of, I think, the approach that'll be taken versus kind of a whole scale decentralization is bad.
Marianne, you've got some question there that you wanted to put to the group?
Yeah, I'm going to try and put a couple together so we can drop, because some are a little redundant, but so I think this is a good question to address in terms of the timing. Will the budget actually get passed? Is it not until the fall? If the Conservatives win, will they come back with significant changes to the budget that gets reintroduced, or will we see a bait and switch? And to build off that, if I may, Alan, you know, we have another viewer who's kind of like, well, since this budget is a non-budget and implies that any government may table a real mid-year budget before next fiscal, is there any chance that such a budget would focus on non-election friendly issues such as homelessness, opioids, or mental health investments? So if we could maybe thread in some of that into our answers, that would be fantastic.
We're going to make this webinar 2 hours long. So no, but this has been a mini controversy, and someone raised it. The finance minister kind of refused to say whether they would reintroduce this budget after the election. Rob, I mean, the legislature is rising, so there's no prospect that this is going to be enacted, right?
Yeah, legislature is done until it reconvenes after the election, and there will be a new budget, believe it or not. So yes, you know, so to answer the question, like, I would view this budget as a platform and not as a budget. It obviously has lots of numbers, and it had a lot of development, a lot of thought, a lot of care taken into targeting certain constituencies. But I also think ultimately that there will be more time to maneuver or remaneuver or reposition things in a new mandate. And it does also presuppose that, you know, maybe in the vein of the question, and some healthy assumption that the Conservatives will get returned to office, which may not happen. So, you know, I think there's you know, a lot of opportunity for different groups to say, hey, you know, here are some forgotten people who require some help and assistance, and certainly make the case and make the claim that that some attention should be diverted their way.
Is that an opportunity for the NDP, Chris, for them to say that this isn't the budget at all, and the budget they're going to bring in is going to be nasty?
Yeah, I mean, they're already that's already one of their key talking points coming into the budget. It's kind of, it reminds me of that old, there was the debate where it's Leighton versus Stephen Harper, where he turned to Stephen Harper and said, "Where are you hiding your platform? Is it under your sweater?" So there's a bit of like old echoes of like, what's your secret agenda? So I think some of that you're going to hear a bunch of that throughout the campaign. Specifically as it relates to the themes that we're trying to keep hammering home on, the fact that there are cuts coming. And you just can't trust this government to do what they've said. They also tried to set up a frame around broken promises, and they released this list of like 37% of the promises that were in the 2018 budget to happen. So I think they do see political opportunity in it, because it helps amplify a bit of their message of, you know, this is a government you can't trust, and it's scary, and watch out, secret agenda. But I think the point is, I think what kind of budget you get depends on the outcome of the election, right? So at the end of the day, like the presupposition that the Conservatives are going to win may not actually turn out to be true. And also just the mechanics of a budget, there's always opportunity before it gets tabled for stakeholders to you know, have a conversation with the minister to outline other things. So, you know, you may see other priorities pop up. It's just, what does the fiscal side look like? Like the joke that I make is, man, that recession is going to hit real hard on June 3rd. I have to see what happens. But
Julie, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'll jump in with two hats on. One, my liberal hat on, and one is my advocate hat on. And with my advocate hat on first, I'll say that I think the fact that this budget is not going to pass is really doing a disservice to Ontarians, because the budgets matter. They do. I mean, certainly there's warrants in place to keep the kind of the lights on in public buildings, but there's a lot of program spending, really important and great program spending that's contained within this budget that's now going to be held up because of this political exercise. And I think that that's an unfortunate thing that's doing a disservice to Ontarians, and now essentially throwing us into a period where we don't have a budget finalized for the province of Ontario, and a lot of that funding is locked up until we can pass this budget. So from an advocacy standpoint, I find it unfortunate. A lot of work goes in. You have limited windows to get new things and new buckets of funding announced. And this one has some interesting buckets of funding that I'd like to see be able to deliver great services and programs to Ontarians. And that's all kind of for nothing right now and tied up in a political exercise. With my liberal hat on, sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I forgot about your liberal hat. Go right ahead.
Yeah, a liberal hat, I would just say that I think it'll play into that sort of, do you have a real plan? So the budget is supposed to be your vision for kind of the out years, this year and beyond. And the fact that they're not committing to reintroduce the same budget means that their plan could change. So do you have a plan? Do you not have a plan? Really, I think that will kind of play into that real leadership kind of narrative, and that Stephen Del Duca is putting out there, and could have some resonance with Ontario voters.
Can I add something here too? Because I find the conversation interesting for maybe different reasons, because, you know, we don't know what the election result's going to be, and I think it would be presumptuous to do that. The Tories strategically decided not to have a vote on this budget, so the opposition could not vote for it or against it. And I've been puzzled by that strategy, because I know when I was in opposition, you know, the Liberals sprinkled everything in the budget and forced us to vote against it because of some poison pill that made it unpalatable for us to vote for. And we were in minority government as well. So the issue is that the Tories strategically chose not to put this budget to a vote, which I'm curious about. But here's the thing. What in this budget would the Liberals or the NDP vote against? And I'm asking that question under the, you know, a possible result is if the Tories return to power as a majority with the most seats, but in a minority situation. Is there enough in this budget for the opposition parties to collaborate with the Conservatives in any way? Could there be? any nuggets. And we don't know the answer to that question. So as hypothetical as it can be to say, well, they're going to bait and switch and doomsday is going to come, the opposite is true too, which is we actually don't know what in the budget would the opposition support or not support.
And guess what? We've got an ongoing series of webinars on the Ontario elections. So maybe we'll get to that next Wednesday on the 4th. But I want to try to wrap things up right now and just do round the clock. Top line. I mean, what impact, if any, is this budget going to have on the upcoming election? Marianne, you first.
I think the election is still a long way away. I think as we've seen, things can change very quickly in any campaign. And as Rob's right, it's wrong to be presumptuous. We can follow the polls, and we've seen already the PCs have dipped somewhat, but just given what's been happening in the geopolitical landscape, I don't think a lot of people could have anticipated what's happening in Ukraine or all sorts of things that have forced governments, not just in Canada, but globally, to be reactive. And I think while there will be focus around some of the key pillars in the budget in their campaign platform, there will inevitably, Alan, be something that comes up on the campaign trail that could easily divert any of the parties from their focal point. So I think it's a bit of a wait and see game. It's a bit too early to tell. We'll have a clearer sense probably a week and a half out from the election.
Rob, final thoughts?
I think this budget is the foundation of the Tory platform, and I think that's what we expected this to be. I think it delivered on that. I wouldn't be surprised through the course of the campaign if one or two major initiatives that weren't included in this budget get added, just to have the conversation be focused on new ideas and moving the province forward. So that's what I'm going to look for next week.
The news Gainsburger, for sure. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gives some of the local races a lot of really interesting flavor now. Like, especially I always look at London, right? Like, there's 3 NDP seats there, and 2 have been long held by really great MPPs. And I think London was mentioned about like 17,000 times in the budget, from two-way all day go to WSIB. Like, let's throw everything at London. So this will the battle for the budget as a communications and a local riding battle tool, I think, is where the Conservatives will use it more specifically, right? Here's all the goodies that we're going to give to Brampton and to Scarborough. So it heats up some of the local races, I think, a bit. We'll just see what the actual impact is on election day.
Last word to you, Julie.
Yeah, similar to Chris, I mean, I think that this election and kind of pandemic elections have really proved to be a kind of questions around, does my government see me? Are they in touch with me? Do they feel me? And this budget has a ton in it for, I think, candidates to go out and say, I see you, I hear you, which is what it's aimed at doing. Whether or not that message resonates and is felt authentically will kind of determine, I think, whether or not folks are shopping for a new leader come June the 2nd, or whether they stay with Doug Ford and feel those arms being wrapped around them.
So Marianne, Rob, Chris, Julie, thank you very much. Those of you who tuned in, thank you very much. As I said, if we didn't get to your question, we will provide a written response. But before we sign off, just one last point, that Earnscliffe over the course of the pandemic has grown exponentially. We've added all kinds of new, really talented people. But this week, we also lost a really talented person to retirement. Tom Sweeting was an original member of the Earnscliffe team when we opened our Toronto office in 2006. Before that, he was an assistant deputy minister for taxation and budgets. He did no less than 33 budgets for Ontario governments and worked on us with this webinar and the piece that we just put out. So we want to wish Tom all the best in retirement. He's going to hit them long and straight, because we know that that's his post-work goal, and we're going to miss him a lot. And our best goes out to him and all others. So thank you very much for tuning in.